Let's take a few minutes to talk about teaching specific disciplinary language and language structures that you have within your disciplines. I don't know if you've thought about this, but that each of your disciplines, by and large, has its own language and its own structure by which it operates. You're obviously pretty good at your language, at the language structure within your discipline. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't have chosen to go into that field. But oftentimes, kids coming into your classrooms do not have that same understanding. And this is something that teachers often forget. They forget that kids don't have the understanding that they have when teaching. So let's talk about what this actually means to teach this. Let's start off by showing a little video that kind of sets the scenario up by Tim Shanahan.
Imagine how many of you would be willing to take a group of 14-year-olds from this part of the country, no preparation, no language study, pick them up and take them to Asia. And we're going to drop them down in the country, and they're on their own. And then in a day or two, we're going to pick them up again. We're going to take them to, we dropped them in Japan, now we're going to take them to China and drop them there. And then we're going to take them to Thailand and drop them there. How many of you would think kids would do great in that situation? It would be silly to do that, wouldn't it? That would be ridiculous. You'd never do such a foolish thing. Except we do it every day in high schools. We take kids and we take them to the country of mathematics at 9 o'clock and drop them down with no explanation of the language or how it works. And 42 minutes later, the bell rings and we move them to the country of history, where they read very, very differently. And we don't tell them, we don't give them any kind of cross-cultural moves at all. And 42 minutes later, the bells ring again and they move off to the land of literature, where people talk about stuff very differently, and the kids are supposed to figure it out all themselves.
Now, let's talk specifically about what happens as the text changes throughout the age or throughout schooling. Overall, we know that text becomes larger. Word complexity increases. Sentence complexity increases. The structural complexity increases. The graphic representation becomes more important to gaining understanding in a content area. The conceptual challenges increase overall, and that text varies widely across the different content areas. So let's take a couple just glances at these things. Many of them you'll recognize. In mathematics, we have a transformation of simple things like multiplication. We have to remember that that never is, oftentimes never, that's not taught. We have introduction of things such as 5-step processes. In this one, but the 5-step writing process. Make sure you use the 5-step writing process. Here we have an example of circuits. What's the best solution for X? A lot of graphic representation. Another one within this data structure. A lot of graphic representation as well as different terminology that are used. And these things have to be accounted for in the way we approach teaching kids and building that understanding of the language structure that's within our disciplines. What's interesting is when we think about and understand the number of words that 5th graders read in a given year at different percentile levels. Now, what's characteristic of 5th graders? Well, one, 5th graders are definitely in that stage where they've gone from learning to read to reading to learn. And these are the students that you're going to have in your classroom. You're going to have people that have moved into this final stage of reading. So let's think about how many words do you think a 5th grader reads in a given year who reads at the 50th percentile? What's interesting is they read 900,000 words. They read 900,000 words. You say, that's quite a few. Well, let's take a look at some other percentiles. How many words do you think a 5th grader reads at the 10th percentile? They read 60,000 words. It's a huge difference. Now let's take a look at 5th graders who read at the 90th percentile. These are the readers who are kind of spot on. They're at the 90th percentile. They read over 4 million, actually, 4 million words in a given year. Now, what does this mean? When we make these comparisons, we can definitely see this, what we call the Matthew effect. and where we have this performance gap that really kind of starts off in third, fourth grade, but definitely is in full effect by fifth grade, and that from fifth grade on up continually increases. A good reason for this increase is the understanding that literacy changes throughout these years, and that when this literacy changes, the demands on reading become critical. And I know you guys, many of you guys are taking a reading class or have taken a reading class. We're going to kind of highlight, though, from disciplinary literacy stance, what are some things we have to cover. So Shanahan 2008 talked about 3 different types of literacy: basic literacy, intermediate literacy, and disciplinary literacy. And then we take all these together and we look at what each one does. Basic literacy is decoding the skills, understanding the various parts of print, the literacy conventions, print versus illustrations, recognition of high-frequency words, and some basic fluency routines. These are generally mastered in the primary grades, Now again, they may not have been mastered. Intermediate literacy is more sophisticated by nature. They have more sophisticated routines, more sophisticated responses. You're able to read multisymbolic words quickly and easily, respond to low-frequency words with some automaticity. You have generic comprehensive strategies that you use and that are used throughout the reading process. You have some cognitive endurance, you monitor comprehension, and this is mostly taking place by the end of middle school. Now, when we move into the disciplines beyond that, we are dealing with highly specific disciplinary literacy. And in today's high schools, middle schools, we're actually dealing with much of this already by the time we get into those upper grade levels in middle schools. But here we are dealing with specialized reading routines and strategies that have to be taught to students that are often forgotten about. So we're looking at teaching the specific nature of the disciplines. This is something that must be communicated to adolescents and something that must be taught. That we have to teach the nature as well as the ways in which experts approach reading of content, the way experts approach it, like how do you approach it? So if we look at history, for instance, we have certain things that are important in history: sourcing, corroboration, context. In English, we have interpreting figurative language, recognizing symbols, irony, satire, all this kind of stuff, different social, cultural, and political contexts that have to be taught. In science, we have prediction, observation, analysis, summarization, presentation of information. In mathematics, seeing relationships between factors, transformation of abstract to concrete, reading, rereading, paraphrasing, navigating between symbols and symbolic systems, all critical in mathematics. That each one of these disciplines broken down has its own structure and language within it. So let's talk about how the things that we're doing and how we go forth and support the practices in disciplinary literacy across the different disciplines. Now, earlier in this class, we talked about information processing, the process the brain goes through to go through that learning process. And within that, we also talked about the information processing. What you should have learned and taken away from that, and what we're talking about here in providing for this literacy that goes through the disciplines, is the understanding that a student has to go through information processing every time they go into your classroom. That there's environmental stimuli that's taking place through the reading, through learning, and everything that's going on in the environment. That there's this notion of the sensory registry, that as the stimuli are coming in, they're going through the sensory registry, and what we're dealing with there, and many of you reflected on this in your projects, the idea that attention is critical, and whether you have their attention and the way they're perceiving it. Notice that there's information loss, so that students not taking in everything you're saying during this time period. And that you are then moving into, once you get them into that process, you're going into short-term memory and working memory. And that from working memory, we then go into output, that there's output that it goes into play. Now, we think about this, we then move to encoding for long-term memory. From long-term memory, then, when we recall information, so if we end a unit on Friday, and on Monday we're starting another unit that builds on Friday's unit, we are then having to call back into play that stuff, that content from Friday. That retrieval process has to go back in to play. Therefore, we're relying on working memory. Now, each one of these periods, you can see where information loss can take place. We also have a number of cognitive and the associated processes of cognition and learning that are also in play here. That what we have to think about as we're thinking about the literacy that takes place in our classrooms, in our environments, is how students are going through that process of understanding the information that's being put forth, either in something that they're doing in the environment, such as working with other students, or in things that they're doing with you by watching you work, and or things they're doing on their own, such as reading a book. All of this is generally a part of what we would consider representation of content. So we are generally considering that notion of representation when we're talking about that literacy, the disciplinary literacy that we're talking about here in this module, and the teaching that goes into that. So what's important is that every content area has specific content knowledge. You're very much aware of that. You're experts in that. Then we also have habits of thinking that goes into that content area, and the way that text is set up, the way that language is set up within your discipline, that we really have to teach them on the diagonal. We have to meet the content knowledge with the habits of thinking that go into the disciplines. We have to teach them on that diagonal. So let's think about how we can do that in a quick strategy here. We can use things such as order devices. And I'm going to provide you a few examples here of what you might do. There are four main types of order devices: sequential, compare and contrast, descriptive, problem solution sort of order device. And these can be displayed and organized according to things such as time, distance, the natural order of consequences, or such thing as cause and effect relationships. And you've seen these, you're well aware of these, but we have to make sure that we bring them into our teaching and that we actually use them effectively within our teaching. So here's some examples. Within history, or within anything really, you might use a timeline, and things are organized by time. Things are organized by time to show a visual relationship amongst the things that we're teaching. You might have a flow chart. I've used them in the way I teach with you guys. Here's one in how a bill becomes a law. Both you can fill these out, so I can do this. You can have the students do it together, or you can have the students do it independently, where they're actually working on developing a flow chart. You might have something that's sequential by nature, such as a water cycle. Again, another visual representation, another organizer to support understanding. You may have a compare and contrast, where they're actually using a pie chart or another type of organizer, such as a table to support this understanding. In summary, understanding the literacy demands within their text is absolutely critical to being successful with all students. That we must provide guidance before, during, and after reading and throughout the instruction. So we can't just hand them something and assume they're able to do it on their own. That we must provide multiple teacher models for how to process the discipline in specific contexts and the text within and information within the text. So we must provide them models for how to do that. You must do things such as think alouds. So focus on things like classroom talk for how to make sense of that text and critical information. This is classroom talk that the students may have, that you may encourage within the classroom, or things that you do, such as think alouds. We must explicitly teach and provide the use of strategies and tools such as organizers and tables to help them comprehend and understand the disciplinary literacy that's taking place within your discipline. These are things that we can all do across the disciplines. Think about